Well, hello and welcome back to the channel. And in this video we are going to focus on building the Junkers Ju87 G1/G2 Stuka from Border Model in 1/35 scale. Now, the first part, this part, is going to be more about the engine and the cockpit build. And the engine is quite good. The cockpit, well, that does have some weird issues. Well, one weird issue in particular and some detail missing, which should be there, I think, when it comes to such a highly detailed, good quality model. And yes, I know these two things go really against what I just said before. Highly detailed, but missing and bad detail. Yeah, well, you should see for yourself when I'm building it. And without any further ado, let's get right into it and divert our attention towards the engine. First things first, let's build the main bulk of the engine. Which, by the way, is not a big deal. There is just a few big parts and the fit is quite tight and good. There are no seam lines, nothing to really worry about. I should say that this engine itself is a quite basic one, but all in all, it's a good starting ground for adding some extra bits and bobs like wiring and cables, tubes, pipes, whatever it is missing from the box. Although this engine is good in quality, design and detail, I'm not going to spend too much time on it, as my main focus with this build is going to be the winter camouflage. And second of all, the cowling is not made in a way out of the box as openable as other kits would have it. So you can't really open the cowling up, show your masterpiece of an engine off and then close it again. Now that doesn't mean that more adventurous, more modeler or an expert modeler, unlike myself, couldn't do it. Of course it's doable. Well, everything is doable, it's just plastic. You can do whatever you want with it, right? But I felt like that it's not my cup of tea at this point, so I'm just going to focus on making the engine as it is and then move on with my life. But here I should mention that these two little thin parts are quite bendy, so you might want to take good care of them and not to bend or even break them. These two parts make up the small tank or whatever that is on the side of the engine struts. Well, on the left side of the engine struts to be exact. And now we are going to focus on the back of the engine with all the other bits and bobs, I should say, you know, the pumps, the carburetors, the whatever else there is. Don't make me look them up on Google, okay? Here I should mention that on these small parts there are no visible problems, everything looks very well molded. A few seam lines here and there, but nothing serious that you can fix with a scraper and some plastic cement. One good advice would be to study the instruction sheet before you dedicate yourself gluing on everything to make sure that all the orientations are correct and that you have a plan of attack, so to speak. So which part comes after which, so you're not going to end up having to wiggle your way through tiny parts and not being able to fit something correctly because you managed to put everything else around it on there. Which I actually did in the end with the very last bit in the middle, like so. But it actually turned out not to be a big deal. Anyway, carry on. Now we're going to focus on the turbo intake or turbocharger. That is going to connect to the filter radiator kind of thing underneath the engine, which for me is one of the most defining features of the Stuka, besides, you know, the gull wings and the canopy and the tail and the overall looks, really. But I think one of the features when you look at it is that big radiator chin it has. I just love big chinned warbirds, you know. I just want to build a Tempest at some point, a big Tempest with its big chin. Oh yes. Oh, sorry, I just really got carried away there with the chins. Oh man. So where were we? Yeah, here you can see me do some cleanup after everything got assembled on the bulk. Yeah, again, I'm not going to care too much, but I care enough just to remove some flashes and some seam lines from the assembly. Now cleaning that up with some plastic cement as usual. That is one trick that I've learned quite late in the hobby, to use some plastic cement to melt away your problems. Now we assemble the bottom side of the engine, and here it's just a couple of tiny pieces that go in the middle over there. Don't worry, everything falls into place quite easily, so there are no problems with the fit. You don't need to exert any force that might break anything. Just let the pieces fall into their places and everything is hunky-dory, just like that. Now putting on the propeller shaft does remind me to tell you that the propeller itself doesn't have that kind of little rubber gasket kind of thing that Tamiya has to fit the propeller on the shaft end, but it is a tight fit in the end, so you don't have to be afraid that you have to glue it in place. It is not going to fall off. Another thing that I might want to mention here in terms of what if someone wants to build this plane without having to build the engine. Well, the instructions doesn't tell you, but I think there is an option to omit the engine, because you can at one point glue the frontal part of the engine with the shaft in it to the cowling from the inside, and that would be enough to hold the propellers in place. Of course, this is not something I tested, I just have the feeling that it's doable in hindsight. Now these two parts are for the exhaust ports on the side of the engine after you assembled it together with the cowling. It's quite a shame though that they didn't make it in a way that the exhausts come directly out of the engine as they should in real life. Now putting everything together, and by that I mean the engine block and the back part of it with all the bits and bobs, you have to be careful a bit to align it properly, because there are no locator pins or anything to help you or guide you, and they are a bit wibbly wobbly, so be prepared to be very generous with the plastic cement. And now that the main engine is out of the way, let's put together the chin radiator, and that is quite simple. It just comes in 4 parts and 1 PE part. This tiny part here, the back of the radiator, can be a bit finicky, but with some determination and plastic cement, it will go into its place and stay there forever. Now cover everything up, and you can see that hole on the side. That's where the PE part will go. I'm not going to care too much about how the side of this radiator is going to look after cementing it together. because nothing will be visible of that. And after the radiator has been done, let's focus on the firewall. And the firewall itself is a crucial part because that's the one that will hold the engine in place with its struts. Now building this thing up is quite straightforward. You have quite a few little tiny pieces and all these pieces have their places. You just put them in there. You just add a tiny bit of glue like that and everything will look nice and clean. And again, I should mention that there weren't any problems in terms of molding and quality. Everything looked nice and sharp. Here and there, tiny amount of seam lines that you can scrape off as usual. And yeah, really, so far this build was quite enjoyable so far. And of course, finishing this final assembly, I went and reached out for my trusty Mission Models grey primer before I went to town with German camo beige from Vallejo color. I know, it's sacrilege what I've just done here, but sadly I didn't have any RLM02 in my stash from Mission Models. That's why I had to do something and I just used this. I think this is the closest one to RLM02 and it's even marketed like that, I think. But again, none of this is going to be actually visible. I could have even used some kind of bright pink color. Nobody would know except for me and perhaps you. But you are not going to tell anyone. But to stay on topic, instead of blackmailing people, after I gave the good old treatment of black primer from Mission Models on the engine, I did some dry brushing with AK's Blue Grey. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I think I went a bit heavy-handed on it, but you should be the judge. Yeah, it doesn't look too good now, doesn't it? And the moral of the story is, when you do dry brushing, make sure you go nice and slow. And after sealing everything with a satin varnish from VMS, that stuff is magical, I tell you. I went ahead and did some panel line washing with AK's panel liner for greens and browns on the firewall itself to make those little tiny pieces pop a bit, but for all the peoples not being able to see. And of course for some XP, because it's always good to level up in your hobbies. And of course then I went ahead and did the very same thing with the engine struts. And when you do an oopsie like that, don't be afraid to use the brush to pick some of the spilled panel line wash out from the recesses and then reapply it somewhere else. And after some cleanup with the cotton buds and waiting for the enamel panel liner wash to dry completely, it's time to assemble the whole engine thingy. Well, except for the radiator. That comes later when we put on the cowling. And when I added the struts to the two sides of the engine, I deliberately didn't use any glue to give myself a bit of a wiggle room when it comes to assembling the cowling and putting on that frontal panel that is between the engine block and the propeller. So I have enough freedom of movement to make sure that everything fits together and the propeller shaft is not crooked or doesn't deviate too much from center. And there you have it. That's how it looks. I know it's not a looker. It's not going to win any model contest shows anytime soon, but it's good enough for me because it's not going to be visible anyways. And now, on to the cockpit. And now comes the fun part, and by fun I mean the cockpit. And oh boy, this cockpit is a weird one. It's not weird in a way that you have badly placed ejection pin marks which are really hard to fill in and sand down. No sir, it's not like that. It's more like detail that it's not there or it's completely wrong and some other crazy shenanigans. It's not that bad per se because the detail that is correct and it's there is good, but man, Border Model really dropped the ball on this one. For example, the pilot seat here. Look at that nicely detailed slab of cushion. I'm sure that the pilot, whoever has to sit in that, will be really pleased how good the backrest is. Now comes the gunner seat. Now this is a pretty simple one as well, nothing fancy, just the top and the bottom part. And this is the radio equipment behind the gunner. Now this is one of the few places where you are going to come across some ejection pin marks. The worst offenders are those top ones, as they are recessed, you have to fill them in. These bottom ones you might actually can avoid them if you want, but because they are protruding, it is much easier just to sand them down. But they are in a place that it is going to be covered up or at least less visible because of the pilot seat, but the top ones are a problem, so you want to take care of those. Like here I do some sprue gooing, and then after that has solidified, dried properly, then they got the sanding treatment. And now I'm going to put together the pilot seat's headrest, which again is nicely molded as a big gray slab, very comfortable for the pilot. Now the cockpit walls come as just one big slab, well, one big slab each, and they are a really good fit. You have 2 free pins to help you put them in place, and there is no wiggle or come on man, do it. Okay, there we are. So there is no wiggle, no misalignment. They are really easy to put them into their place. You can be very generous with the plastic cement here. As you can see, these are quite big pieces to glue in. Now that we are done with the sidewalls, let's do the... Attention, attention, this is not the right place for the control stick. And by not the right place, I mean that this is completely wrong how Border Model did it. Because if you look at it, I think the pilot would have a hard time to pull the stick towards themselves. And before we go back and fix our mistake over there, let's focus on the sidewall with some dremeling. And this is because this tiny piece doesn't go right away on the part where it should be, so you need to dremel it out proper, and that should be it, like so. Now it's a good fit. And other than this one, the rest goes on quite easily, and by the rest mean just 2 or 3 other parts. Most of the detail is directly molded onto the cockpit walls. And of course, I should reiterate here that the molding is really good. Apart from some missing detail or bad detail within the cockpit, these cockpit walls look really good. And I should say in a positive way that Border Models did a great job on it, but next time they really need to do a bit more research about, you know, where the control stick of a plane goes mainly. And of course, try to ignore this guy finicking around with the tweezers, because he's not the perfect example in this case for the term easily. And luckily, besides this one tiny PE sheet part, there aren't any others for the cockpit. And to be perfectly honest with you guys, I don't understand why they didn't make it in plastic, because that would have been a much better choice for this handle in particular, which I think it is the throttle. And now comes fixing my previous mistake by filling in the hole after cutting off the control stick and dremeling it down to a flush surface. Here you can see another ugly ejection pin mark on the back of the pilot seat. And using some bit of sprue glue, we fill that in and then later sand it down to be nice and clean. And whilst we're at it, we can also fill those two tiny holes, which are the guide pin holes for the pilot's headrest. Using my trusty Dremel, I decided to make some textures on the pilot seat's cushion. You know, just to make it to look like realistic enough to give that kind of texture that a cushion would have after extended use. And after I used my Dremel, I went and slobbered on some Tamiya extra thin cement to soften up the plastic surface and make everything a bit smoother. And whilst I was concentrating on the pilot seat, I decided that it's time to do my own belts and harnesses, because the ones that Border Model supplies with this kit is not just a damn joke, because it's two thin PE sheets, well, not sheets, but how should I call it? It's just two thin pieces of PE for the pilot seat only. So to rectify this, I decided to use masking tape and these thin brass wires, or should I call them pipes rather, from Albion Alloys. And what I did, I just formed the triangle for the end of the harness, and then I just cut it off. I know it's not that perfect, and some other modelers make much better work of it, but for me it's good enough. And now that I have those triangles, now I do, well, if the focus would be correct, then you would see that I took a thin strip of masking tape and then I fold it together, having the triangle at the end of it, just like that. And after I have done all the harnesses that I needed, I used some CA glue to glue them in place. Now I don't know how realistic or unrealistic the back of the seat is going to look like when I have these on there, but at this point I was thinking I'd rather have an unrealistic harness than not to have anything. After the back has dried, now I am going to glue the harnesses to the seat in front. And now thinking of it in hindsight, the way how I mimicked the kinks, how it droops onto the seat, it might not be realistic, but again, it's better than having absolutely nothing. Because, you know, if the manufacturer doesn't give you any proper harnesses or pilot figures, then you have to do what you can do or you are willing to do. And in this case, this is what I came up with, and actually I was quite satisfied with the end result, but more on that later. Now it doesn't look that much unpainted, but after painting and weathering and all that things that I did, it is going to be okay. Oh, and by the way, I did do the same harnesses for the gunner seat as well. Now again, I don't know how realistic they are and what kind of harnesses the gunner seat had, if it had any. This is what I did and I am happy about the outcome. But again, more on that later. And here are the finished harnesses for the gunner seat. I think these look quite nice. Now let's continue with fixing the control stick. And for that, I did create a bit of a boxy thing from leftover plastic from here and there and glued it in place. Because if you look at any reference pictures, you will see that the control stick is in fact on like a boxy thing on top in front of the pilot seat. And that's what I did. Created the boxy thing and put the control stick on top of that. Like this. It's not perfect, but it is good enough for what it needs to do. Or let's say what it needs to represent. And after that was done, and I finished priming the surface of the cockpit internals with the usual suspect, which is Mission Models Gray Primer, I went ahead and used Mission Models RLM 66, which is Mission Models 89. And I should say that I found it to be very dark for my taste. So what I did is that I lightened it up with some Mission Models White with the ratio of 10:2. This means 10 RLM 66, well 10 drops of RLM 66 and 2 drops of white. This gave me a much brighter dark gray, so to speak, as the default, but I don't really mind because I want to make sure that the details are clearly visible when someone would look through the cockpit windows, which might not be a case if I wouldn't have used any white in the color. Because let's be honest, the dark gray, the default RLM 66 is quite intensively dark, and when it comes to scale models, to see the tiny details, you really want to lighten up the colors a tiny bit, because really dark colors like the RLM 66 will just hide a lot of things. But that's again my opinion. You don't have to follow this advice at all. You do you, my friend. You do you. And after everything was sufficiently covered with RLM 66, I used Monster Brown from Army Painter to paint the base color for the pilot seat's backrest. And the headrest as well, of course. Next up is to color the harnesses with Banshee Brown. I think the end result is quite good. Now let's move on and do the same thing for the pilot seat. And again, here is the end result, and I am quite satisfied. Looking good so far. Now let's do some edge highlight on the backrest just to give a bit more depth to its looks. It's not too much, it's just a tiny touch up with a slightly lighter brown than the base to make it more interesting in texture. And of course the same goes for the headrest as well. And after that has been done, let's focus on the harnesses buckles, or those triangles that I made for their ends, and color them with silver. This really gives a metallic sheen to it and gives a bit of extra depth for the overall looks. And again, in both instances, the results speak for themselves. I am quite happy how they turned out. But let's not stop here and continue working on the rest of the cockpit. First, on the control stick. Then, let's move on to the side and use some dragon red to use it on those tiny little buttons all along across that control surface, which I don't really know what they do. I might need to read up on that. And when finished, we go and use black from Vallejo Model Colors on the rest of the buttons. The same amount as the red, it's just now black. And it looks quite good, except for that tiny speck of a white paint dot that is underneath, but at this point I thought to myself, it's going to be fine. That is not going to be the worst thing ever happened. So let's continue using black on the control stick's top. And then I moved on to color in that little box next to the gunner seat, which by the way would have been nice if Border Model would have made it separate piece that you can glue on later after you painted it whole. Now I don't know if this black and brown scheme that I used is the correct one, but I found some reference images and it looked like that, so I just went with it. And now we focus our attention on the radio equipment behind the gunner. Here I use the black only to color in the dials. According to some reference images that I saw, they look like they've been overall gray and only the dials were black, and some of the knobs and other tiny pieces. And this is how it looks. Not my best work, I will admit. Now on to the other side of the cockpit. Now here I use some light brown on the side of that wheel. I don't know what that wheel does. Again, I am not an expert in the cockpit of the Stuka, but according to reference images, that was either made out of wood, I think, or maybe leather, or perhaps just a brownish plastic, but anyway, it was brown, so I went with brown, and then use red on some of the knobs and handles that you can see here. and some black here and there. And now it's time to do the panel lining with AK's panel liner for gray and blue colors. And here again I went to town on it. Of course, I should mention that before I did this, I covered everything with VMS satin varnish. And when I said that I went to town on it, I really meant that I really went to town. You can see that I am not holding back and slobber everywhere. And of course, this is another good excuse why you might want to use a bit of lighter colors, because when you go on top of that with dark weathering or wash like I do here, then that will darken the colors further. Of course, make sure that the wash gets everywhere, every little nook and cranny, every button, everything is covered properly. So again, as I usually say, just slobber it on, and later you can wiggle it around, move it around with the brush and with some tiny amount of thinner, which I do after. And I really went ham-fisted on the bottom of the cockpit, to not just to try to have all the detail pop a bit more, but to even mimic some staining, some grime, you know, like if it was really used and some oil and dirt and everything accumulated on the bottom. And now you're going to see me fine-tuning this wash with some enamel thinner and a brush. And this really helps you to move around the wash into places where you want to accumulate it the most, or to even lift some of it off if you have too much of it in some places. And here is the end result for the right hand side panel. Now let's move to the other one and do the very same thing as I did before by moving around the wash with some enamel thinner and a brush. And lastly, we concentrate on the bottom of the cockpit. And here you can see me not just moving the wash closer to the edges, but I do remove quite a lot as well. And it's because I thought in the end that it is too much and it needs some fine-tuning, which will result in this. But let's move on to the rest of the cockpit, which is now the radio equipment's wall. Well, the back that is behind the pilot. And here I'm just using a cotton bud to remove the excess. In hindsight, I should have used a brush here as well, because with the cotton bud I did manage to remove quite a lot of the panel liner around those rivets. And now let's glue everything in, which means first goes in the radio equipment. Then we put in the pilot seat. Next up are the ammunition boxes for the gunner. I know this is the first time you seeing them, but trust me, there is nothing really special about them, which is a shame though, because there is some missed detail. But now let's concentrate on gluing in the window, well, the observation window between the pilot's legs, where they could find their target to dive bomb them. So I do think that Border Model did a whoopsie with this one, because I think the G1 and G2 variants of the Stuka don't really have these. Because yes, they are going to dive on their target, but they are doing a much shallower dive. So they're not going to fly right on top of them and then do a very steep dive as they would when they have bombs. But let's continue and let's assemble the cockpit. And by assemble, I mean that you have to assemble the fuselage to fit everything together like that. And the fit is quite good. It's really good. The fuselage fit is exceptionally good. I was very, very pleased with it. It really goes together really well, and there are no gaps at all. Looking great, looking great. Now when you're doing this bottom part, you want to make sure that the fit and the alignment of the two halves is good, because you have a lot of raised rivet detail here. So if the seam line, the gluing line is bad and is very prominent, then you end up with an unrecoverable situation, because you cannot sand it down properly, and if you sand it down properly, you're going to lose all the rivet detail. Now on top it's fine because everything is recessed, so you can rescribe it, but again, the bottom, you don't even want to squish it too much together where the plastic oozes out a bit along the lines, because again, you're not going to be able to remove that without damaging the surrounding area. And with this small nugget of truth, let's call it the end of this video, and for the next one we will continue our journey with this big bird here. And until then, please like and subscribe, and see you on the next one. Bye bye.